I have a question on the moral argument, kind of comprehensory question. I understand that the first premise of the argument, if God does not exist and objective moral values and duties do not exist, is not logically equivalent to the claim that objective moral values and duties exist if and only if God exists. That is, it's not a biconditional. In a recent Q&A on the Reasonable Faith website, you explained that the first premise in the moral argument is actually a counterfactual. Now, if the first premise were a biconditional, I take it that to demonstrate its truth, you'd have to outline the necessary and sufficient conditions for the existence of objective moral values and duties, and then show that necessarily those conditions cannot obtain on atheism. But my question is, what must be done to defend the first premise as a mere counterfactual, and more specifically, can you outline the premises that you would in fact use in an argument for the truth of that counterfactual, kind of step by step?
Yeah.
Bill, could you translate the question for us as well? Thank you.
Could we bring up the moral argument slide? As I stated it today, I think I stated it in the indicative mood, that if if God does not exist, then moral values and duties do not exist. But I think one can actually state it as a subjunctive conditional, and this is the way I ran it in my debate with Peter Milliken last night. I did use that. Namely, if God did not exist, then objective moral values and duties would not exist. And the argument would be exactly the same, namely, that if atheism were true, if naturalism were true, then there just isn't any reason to regard human beings as loci of intrinsic moral value. They would just be relatively advanced primates, and I just don't see any reason, any explanation for thinking that the flourishing of these primates on this little planet is the source of intrinsic moral value. Especially difficult for the atheist view would be source of moral obligation. Where would moral obligations and prohibitions come from if there is no moral lawgiver to prohibit or prescribe moral duties? As chemists and ethicists alike recognize, prescriptions require a prescriber, and that would be missing if atheism were true. So the arguments would be exactly the same, whether it's a counterfactual or whether it's an indicative conditional.